Those on board, according to Starrett, became almost palpable as they beheld the level of destruction that had occurred well inland of where Galveston was located. As everywhere they looked, there were parts of houses, furniture, piles of debris, and even the eerie sight of a rocking horse sitting in the middle of nowhere. Then there were the boats that were scattered about the plains. They even saw in the distance a large ship that had impossibly run aground in the middle of the prairie. Ultimately, the train was forced to stop well short of its final destination due to the flooding. Those on board then had to continue on foot to nearby Texas City, where the soldiers commandeered a boat that they then loaded with supplies and sailed across the Bayonne to begin assisting the people of Galveston and to gauge the level of destruction there. Meanwhile, Starrett and the other passengers from the train, who were likely people with family in the city, were left to wait until Tuesday afternoon to set off. In the meantime, though, the signs they saw were not good, as bodies started washing up on the Texas City shoreline. So many bodies washed up, in fact, that their initial attempts to bury them in shallow graves had to be shifted to burning them, as there were simply too many bodies to deal with in a timely manner. Things then somehow only grew bleaker when the ship that Starrett and the others took to Galveston got close, as the stench of decaying flesh quickly became overpowering. The sheer level of death and destruction from this hurricane is really hard to comprehend. Indeed, it cannot be overstated that essentially everywhere one looked in Galveston in the aftermath, it was like something out of a horror movie or a nightmare. For example, one of the most gruesome scenes I read about was the sight of 100 corpses found suspended in the branches of a grove of cedars. Bodies had been carried there by the floodwaters and had subsequently gotten caught in the branches. The same thing explains why 43 bodies were found lodged in the braces of a railroad bridge. Numerous bodies were also found half buried in the sand on the beaches. Among these was the body of one of the toddlers from the orphanage, which meant as this body was pulled free, they found a clothesline tied to its little waist, which when they pulled upon it, they found another child's body. One after another, then 8 children were found, all tied to a dead nun. To try and deal with all this, improvised morgues were set up in places like warehouses, where the bodies of the dead were laid out stretching from wall to wall in the large buildings. It was in places like this where survivors like Isaac Klein came to see if their loved ones had died and if their bodies had been recovered. Judson Palmer, the secretary of Galveston's YMCA, for example, would find his wife May's body at one of these morgues. A terrible loss, but at least he knew for sure that she had died. Others, though, would be left to wonder whether or not their loved ones had perished or had survived, and for whatever reason not been able to contact them. Few in the city then were as lucky as Dr. Young, who had before the storm wisely wired his wife to stop with their children in San Antonio until he sent word that it was safe. Scarcely any then would escape without losing someone that they knew, as it's estimated that somewhere around 8,000 people died as a direct result of this storm. With such a death toll, the most pressing question for the people of Galveston quickly became what to do with the literally thousands of dead bodies they were now surrounded by. Indeed, the sheer number of corpses now populating the city made their disposal the top priority of the city's new relief committee that was running things in the wake of the disaster. Their initial plan to deal with this pressing issue, which was formed on the Monday following the hurricane, was to bury their dead at sea. That entire day, then, wagons of all types were used to haul literal stacks of bodies down to the wharf, where they were then loaded onto a barge that was then to be pulled out to sea by a tugboat, at which point workers would be tasked with weighing down the bodies and throwing them overboard. Now, this was obviously a job that no one wanted to do, so soldiers rounded up 50 black men at gunpoint and then forced them to do this work, with the only incentive other than the whole guns pointed at them thing being the promise of whiskey to try and ease the horror and revulsion of this work. An offer thought of and approved of by even temperance-minded officials who could not deny the horror they were asking these men to go through. Now, between hauling the bodies to the wharf, forcing men to do this work at gunpoint primarily because of their skin color, and just the amount of time it took to do such work, the first barge load of 700 bodies wasn't ready to be pulled out to sea until late Monday afternoon, which meant by the time the barge had been hauled a significant enough distance out, it was too dark for the men on board to do anything. So they now had to spend the entire night on a ship full of corpses. Come dawn then, these men immediately set to work attaching anything at hand that would sink the bodies. By Tuesday night, though, it had become obvious that this plan was not going to work, as scores of bodies had washed up on shore with weight still attached. Meanwhile, the need to do something about these bodies was becoming of greater importance with every passing minute, as decomposition was already setting in. Plus, the summer heat, which had briefly abated on the Saturday of the storm, returned in full force in the coming days, making everything effectively worse. You see, in addition to the obvious health hazards so many decomposing bodies represented, this decomposition process was going to make moving these bodies even more difficult. Plus, there was also the sanity of everyone in the city to consider, as it can't be stressed enough how ever present these bodies were in the days following the hurricane. Keep in mind that it's believed that somewhere in the range of 8,000 people had died, so bodies were basically everywhere. Plus, even once the cleanup process had begun, all that really meant was that there were now wagon loads of corpses being hauled through the streets. One survivor, Nell Hertford, for example, would write of such an experience, quote, "There were 2 wagons full taken from the wreck right here in front of us on the esplanade, and the poor things had stiffened in the positions in which they had died, most of them with their hands clasped high in the air in the attitude of a prayer. The ones I saw will haunt me to my dying day." Adding that as a result of sights like these, quote, "I would gladly turn my back on Galveston forever." It soon became obvious to all involved that the only practical solution to this situation was burning the bodies, a choice that was to many at the time borderline sacrilegious. Indeed, cremation was still a fairly new and highly controversial practice in the U.S., yet the leaders and people of Galveston had no choice, so the dead gangs, as they were known, set about piling up bodies and setting them aflame. Work that they did in 30-minute shifts while being given as much whiskey as they desired to deal with the horrible sights and even worse smells. These burnings would continue throughout the day and night as witnesses remembered seeing huge fires lighting up the night sky in virtually any direction you turned. A process that would continue for at least 2 months as the city continued its cleanup efforts which included removing the rubble of fallen buildings and tearing down the massive structure that had swept blocks of houses away, as both of these tasks invariably resulted in uncovering more bodies on almost a daily basis. Meanwhile, as the city's newspapers got up and running again, in the place of normal advertisements, local companies instead ran ads assuring their customers that they wouldn't be jacking up their prices as was so often the case following disasters. One store, in fact, even promised to sell their stock at manufacturer's cost. Then, in place of the normal personals, were messages from individuals, either looking for others to see if they had survived, or trying to alert others that they were alive, and typically where they would be able to meet. Elsewhere in the country, as news got out about what happened in Galveston, aid began rushing their way. Houston, their rival and neighbor, due to their proximity, would be one of the first to respond by sending 1,000 loaves of bread to help feed the survivors. The steamship the Lawrence also arrived early on, carrying 100,000 gallons of fresh water, while the soldiers who arrived to survey and confirm the devastation brought with them food and tents. Newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst also made a point of sending a train full of relief supplies early on, but despite being among the first to send aid, his train arrived after many others had, which robbed Hearst of the publicity impact. Clara Barton's Red Cross in particular would receive thousands of dollars in donations to aid the people of Galveston, donations that range from amounts like $1, which the city of Moose Jaw in Canada and the state of New Hampshire both decided to donate for some reason, amounts which were dwarfed by the $4 sent by the Sabbath School of Odell, Illinois, the $12 sent from the Kansas State Insane Asylum, and the $24 sent by the College Eureka Brass Band of Thibodaux, Louisiana. You also had even more substantial donations like the $13,000 sent from Liverpool and the additional $14,550 that was also donated by that city's Cotton Association. Hearst, meanwhile, would donate over $50,000 and the state of New York would send nearly $94,000 to aid the people of Galveston. Now, the Red Cross's efforts would come under scrutiny, as they were accused of squandering the money or withholding clothing from the city's destitute and black population. How true these accusations are, I can't say, but some of this does seem to be the result of the Red Cross receiving a lot of clothing donations that were simply too ragged or too worn to be distributed in some place like Galveston. Plus, there was also an instance where they received a donation of 144 women's shoes, which sounds great, but the problem was these shoes were all samples, meaning that each and every shoe was for the left foot, making them not particularly useful. Another significant figure in the rebuilding efforts was Rabbi Henry Cohen, who on the fateful Saturday had spent the early hours of the storm handing out blankets, umbrellas, and apples to the families he saw passing by his home as they made their way to the relatively safer city center. The rabbi, who once reportedly said, quote, "Other men play golf for recreation. My hobby is helping people." Having been one of the lucky ones to survive the storm with his entire family intact, once again showed his charitable impulses as he drove a mule-driven wagon through the city, delivering food and medical supplies to those in need. Also, once the initial emergency passed when the battered city was in need of new residents due to the thousands of deaths and the many survivors who opted to move someplace else, Rabbi Cohen also stepped up and in doing so, not only aided Galveston, but also poor Jewish immigrants fleeing the pogroms of Europe and the Russian Empire. You see, in response to the need of his adopted city and fears that the federal government may impose quotas restricting the number of new Jewish immigrants arriving in New York, Rabbi Cohen spearheaded efforts by Jewish organizations to divert immigrants away from New York to Galveston. As a result, between 1907 and 1914, some tens of thousands of Jews arrived in Galveston's port, with some moving on to other places in Texas and the Midwest, and some establishing roots in the city. A city that, as it turned out, even in the wake of the worst natural disaster in the nation's history, was determined to rebuild. The first and most important part of this plan, as featured in an elaborate display at the 1904 World's Fair, was the construction of a sea wall, an idea that had been proposed before but was abandoned. This time, though, they would follow through, and indeed the initial 17-foot-tall, 3-mile-long sea wall has since been extended and now stretches on for 10 miles. Along with this new protective seawall, the city of Galveston itself was also raised up higher above sea level. Workers using screw jacks, you see, raised some 2,000 buildings underneath which some 11 million pounds of sand was pumped in to fill the resulting gap. In addition to raising surviving structures, the city on this new higher ground also built a grand new opera house and a huge new hotel de Galvez as a show of their determination to rebuild better than ever. This entire rebuilding and recovery process took some 12 years. Then, in 1915, yet another hurricane came bearing down on their island. This time, though, they were much more prepared, and as a result, only lost 8 lives to that storm. Yet, even though Galveston would rebuild, they would lose their race with Houston to become the great Texas port city. You see, since Houston was located further inland instead of sitting exposed out on an island, Houston came to be seen as a safer bet for investors now that the idea that hurricanes couldn't come that way was officially dead and gone. As a result, a ship channel to Houston began construction in the wake of the Galveston disaster and was completed in 1914, removing the one barrier, Houston's shallow waterways, that stood in the way of it becoming a major port. Notably, Houston would also benefit greatly from the 1901 Spindletop strike, as oil overtook cotton as Texas's chief export, which was important for Houston as that city lay closer to the rail lines carrying the oil than Galveston was. Galveston then, instead of becoming the next great American city, which was a center of commerce and transportation, opted to transform itself into a vacation destination due to its miles of beaches and ample fishing opportunities. As we continue wrapping up this tale, though, the question still remains, why exactly was the death toll so great in this storm? For context, compare the Galveston storm to one of the greatest modern-day disasters, Hurricane Katrina, which struck Louisiana and New Orleans in particular in 2005. Katrina, while a catastrophic storm in its own right, did not come anywhere close to the 1900 storm's death toll, not to diminish the sheer destruction Katrina visited upon the people of Louisiana, nor to diminish any one of the 1,836 lives lost in that storm, but that number pales in comparison to even the most conservative estimate of 6,000 lives lost in 1900, with many now estimating that 8,000 had actually lost their lives in Galveston alone, with several thousand more likely dying elsewhere along the coastline. So, why did so many more people die in 1900 than in 2005? Well, for one, as monstrous as a storm as Katrina was, having at one point being determined to be a Category 5 storm, it seems like by the time it made landfall, it had gone down to a Category 3. In contrast, while the 1900 storm is not believed to have ever reached Category 5 levels, it seems to have reached Category 4 and remained at that level when it hit land. Indeed, the barometer at the Levi building would record a reading of 28.48 inches, which at the time was the lowest reading ever recorded by a U.S. Weather Bureau station. Yet as low as this was, the reading would have been even lower closer to the eye of the storm, which did not come near the center of downtown. In addition to the sheer power of the storm was the fact that unlike what Isaac Klein and other scientists of the day believed, the shallow slope of the seabed around Galveston did not make the island immune from a storm surge. In fact, as it turned out upon further study that was done in reaction to what happened in Galveston, it was determined that a shallow slope actually made flooding even more likely. Then there was the fact that this storm surge was also particularly bad because the storm struck Galveston head on, thereby focusing all the water it was pushing ahead of it right into the city. Most importantly, though, as I feel like I've hammered home time and again, no one was really expecting the 1900 storm. Thus, they were caught completely unprepared, whereas with Katrina, thanks to satellites and modern